Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Teima Takuawa, ko Devon Rohe, ko Lydia Furse aho, nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So, good afternoon everybody. As Miranda said, my name is Lydia and I'm here in my capacity as a researcher of women's rugby. I'm hoping that I can convince you all that women's rugby is a fascinating subject. Those who are in the room already, fantastic, you've made that decision, you're here, but everybody on the radio as well, I hope you are going to enjoy this talk. And it has been really enlightening putting together this research with that local focus. So we're going to be exploring the development and meaning behind women's rugby in the Manawatū, and occasionally I'll pull out to say how that compares to the development of women's rugby in other countries. My expertise comes from having completed this PhD, and New Zealand was a really important part of that global study. But what's particularly interesting is actually how significant Palmerston North, Manawatū, and indeed the whole lower North Island has been in the history of women's rugby. I also want to shout out that although some of this work comes from my PhD, a lot of it does come from the New Zealand Rugby Museum's brilliant exhibition called The Herstory of Women's Rugby, which was put together in time for the most recent Women's Rugby World Cup, played here in Aotearoa in 2022. Did anybody here follow that tournament? A couple of us. Did anybody go to any games? And do we know who won that tournament? That is the most important question. New Zealand, we can have some national pride, everybody. It was indeed New Zealand. And the Rugby Museum created this exhibition to go alongside the tournament and deliberately made it travelling so that it could be at the games and also at different venues as part of the celebrations for New Zealand winning. And we actually have some of it on display in the library at the moment. It is on the first floor in the Sports and Games non-fiction section, so please do go check that out if you're interested. It continues to travel both the North and the South Island, and we do have some availability in its calendar. So if you're involved in an organisation and you'd like to host this exhibition, come and chat to us at the Rugby Museum. We'll see what we can do. To get back to the main subject of today, I am keen to give a quick caveat that this is an ongoing research subject. I have as many questions as answers, and there might be people hearing this today who have some of those answers for me. So I've left time for questions at the end today, and also if people want to get in touch, I'll read out my contact details at the end. So we're going to be looking at tracing a number of local links to the Herstory of women's rugby. Firstly, examining the concept of rugby as a masculine sport from the 19th century, and then we'll explore a couple of examples of women playing in the 1920s and local reactions to those games, before moving on to the very first interprovincial women's rugby game, which took place right here in Palmerston North in 1980. Finally, I'm going to celebrate some local sports stars who've made a huge impact on the world stage as part of the Black Ferns, New Zealand's national women's team. So, when rugby first arrived in New Zealand, it was already culturally aligned with masculinity. British colonists brought the game that they had learned at their all-boys schools with them as they settled in New Zealand. This is exactly the story of Charles Monroe, known as the father of rugby in New Zealand, who was schooled in Britain, and when he came back, he organised the first official rugby game in 1870. There's actually a statue of him outside of Te Manawa, the Globe Theatre, and that's where the Rugby Museum is located. So far more than today, rugby football was a violent sport, played by boys and young men, and Victoria gender norms, or what would be socially acceptable for men or women to do, did not allow for middle class and upper class women to participate in violent or overly physical activities. In fact, medical knowledge at the time even promoted the idea of the eternally wounded woman, who was believed to be inherently weaker and more fragile than men, and was advised to save her life force to pass on to the next generation. And while Pākehā women in New Zealand were in some cases a little bit freer from these Victorian gender norms, perhaps as part of what's been called frontier feminism, women didn't immediately rush onto the rugby pitch in New Zealand. However, in 1891, an Auckland-based businesswoman, Nita Webb, did attempt to set up professional women's rugby. She went straight in at the professional level. She placed this advert in the newspaper, and the plan was to bring the young women together to train and then tour the country and perhaps even to Australia and England if the matches were successful. And this might seem a bit outlandish now when those of you who are aware, women's sports are still fighting the professional journey, still fighting to get kind of that living wage pay for some of them. But at the time, there are other examples of women's sports teams touring. From Britain, for example, there was the British Lady Footballers in 1895 and the original English Lady Cricketers in 1889. And these tours were quite successful because they traded on women participating in these sports as a novelty. So they had that curiosity factor. And we can trace a similar thing with the 1888 men's tour. So that's a group of what's called the Natives Tour. It's mostly Maori, those of Maori and Pākehā heritage, and 5 Pākehā men who left New Zealand, travelled to Britain. And yes, people did go to those games to watch a rugby game, but they were really intrigued to meet people from the other side of the world, and specifically that cultural difference. They actually started the practice of performing a haka before the rugby game, which is the origins of that tradition that we still practice today. So this idea by Nita Webb was really relied on that similar idea of novelty. She expected people would be willing to pay to watch women playing rugby because it was unusual. However, it seems to have been a step too far for New Zealand in 1891. Negative comments were widely repeated in the press, including this sentiment from the Fielding Star, which was published on the 30th of June, 1891. And it tied together the idea of women's rugby and women's right to vote. So I'll just read it out for you. What is the world, or rather New Zealand, coming to? A team of lady footballers is being organised in Auckland to do the colony. No wonder our reps are losing heart and considering the advisability of retiring on their past victories. Perhaps this was the reason why a correspondent in the Star recently objected to the electoral franchise being extended to women, as it may be calculated to shake the nerves of the strongest. So evidently, for this Fielding newspaper, women's enfranchisement and women playing rugby was a step too far. And while women did get the right to vote in 1893 here in New Zealand, Nita Webb's proposed tour didn't have as much success. There's no evidence that a game was ever played in public. So tours like this could provide opportunities for women to play, in this case maybe to train at rugby. We believe that people did travel and come together and train at rugby. But this kind of tour is notoriously ineffective at changing attitudes towards female participation in traditionally masculine sports anyway. Rugby remained a man's sport well into the 20th century at both the local, national and international level. But the game's popularity here in New Zealand did encourage more women to have a go at playing. There's such a cultural relevance of rugby that more people are trying to get involved in it in New Zealand than in any other countries that I've looked at. There was quite a serious attempt to form a women's club in Wellington in 1921, but most female involvement came from one-off games, usually organised as fundraisers, and this was the case for this women's team from Levin in 1923, which played to raise funds for the Domain's grandstand. And while the players look quite serious, you can see that they are in full rugby uniforms. You can get that sense that this isn't being taken seriously by the sporting establishment because the referee on the far right-hand side, Mr. J. Proctor, is dressed as a woman. So he's wearing a white dress with a hat at the back there. You can also spot Mrs. M. Winiata in the centre. She is acting as a chaperone for the women, as was customary at the time. But I just want you guys to remember the Winiata name, though, because that will come up again later. This picture was actually donated to the Rugby Museum by Margaret Judd, granddaughter of the identified H. Ruby Judd. and was printed in a newspaper after 1923. We're unsure of when this was printed. And I can't find any records from 1923 to explain more about the game, so we don't actually know who they were playing against. Given other examples of women's rugby at the time, it's likely it could have been another women's team if there were enough of them, or it may have been a men's team who might have been dressed as women or had some other sort of limit on their ability, for example, playing with one hand behind their back. So these are opportunities for women to have a go at rugby, often in front of large crowds, but again, these games are not really doing anything to promote rugby football for girls and women. Instead, they're kind of part of a carnival atmosphere where cross-dressing is permitted as a way to have fun. The men are dressed as women and the women are dressed as rugby players, therefore rugby players are men. And it's reinforcing that women playing rugby is not the normal way of things. What's interesting, really, a lot of people ask me, was there ever a ban on women playing rugby in New Zealand? And there was no official ban, but there really wasn't a need. There was such a strong cultural association between rugby and masculinity that women rarely sought to participate in the game more formally. That 1921 game I mentioned in Wellington, they came together for a year but disbanded later due to strong social pressure and the fact that the rugby unions wouldn't let them play on their pitches. So they couldn't get access to the necessary support, physical, financial, that they needed to play. These same kind of charity or novelty one-off games continued throughout the mid-20th century, and really in some ways the first interprovincial game in 1980, which was between Manawatū and Hawke's Bay, was organised in the same manner. The game was actually conceived as a publicity stunt by two radio stations, 2ZA in Palmerston North and Bay City Radio in Napier. 2ZA announcer Kev Lachlan promoted and organised the Manawatū team, while in Napier, announcers Barry Bazza Corbett and a youthful John Macbeth did likewise for the Bay. There was no intention of it being staged as a first. It wasn't until plans were well advanced that somebody actually suggested that this rep game could be a first in New Zealand rugby. In the match programme, Manawatū Rugby Union President Owen Gleeson wrote, "We have two special curtain raisers today, the first being Manawatū ladies versus Hawke's Bay ladies. I believe a first in New Zealand for ladies representative rugby." The build-up to the game appears to have involved a few warm-up or selection matches. Hawke's Bay played two warm-up games, defeating Muzzers Madams 46-4 and Waiaroa 44-4. And the Manawatū team took their name from the radio presenter and were known as in the press as Lachlan's Lovelies. So names like Muzzers Madams, Lachlan's Lovelies, I'll come to a few more in a moment, they're very 80s, and they're also indicative of the way in which these games were framed. There's no real attempt to start something with this game. We're not trying to build a platform for women's rugby to develop into a mass participation sport. It's all a bit of a joke, yeah? However unseriously as it might have started, however, the players themselves took it seriously, and the organisers recalled being swamped by enthusiastic women when they put out the call for participants. It seems that lots of sporty women had the rugby bug and seized the opportunity to get onto the pitch. The Manawatū selection day featured 4 teams. The first match was between Kiotoa Cuties and Lachlan's Lassies. Game was described as quite sedate, whereas the second match between Oliver's Fillies and Lachlan's Lovelies was quite a mismatch of rugby styles. The Fillies were bigger and more powerful, while the Lovelies played a running style of rugby, which in the end won out. And from these matches, players were selected for the 15 to represent Manawatū versus Hawke's Bay. The game kicked off on Sunday, the 14th of September, 1980, in what is now known as the Central Energy Trust Arena, but then was known as the Showgrounds Oval. And the fixture was scheduled as a curtain raiser for the men's NPC game for the same provinces, which Manawatū won 43-23. That's the men's results. At the time, Manawatū was one of the best men's rugby teams in the country, so it was a real draw to get these women to be able to play on the showgrounds. I'm going to let Helen jump in here and tell a little bit of her own story. She was actually the captain in 1980.
First question I have is, you were considered an athlete before playing rugby. What sport did you play and what drove you to play rugby?
Sport, hockey and a little bit of cricket. Wasn't that great at cricket. Had to be wicket keeper because I couldn't throw it very well on the ball. But and a lot of horse riding. That's what I did. And to play rugby I just heard it advertised on the radio, really. Come and play rugby for this team.
Is that how that first exhibition or women's rugby match was, how it came about? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Definitely was how it came about. It was on the radio, so then all the women put their names forward, and then we turned up and we had a couple of trial games, and from there they picked the team to play Hawke's Bay.
Oh, that would have been another question of mine, was there any preparation? And you talked about trial games, like it was obviously advertised on the radio from 2ZB and 2XS back then, and putting out forecasting to get women involved in playing. What was the preparation like? What were there coaches? Were there many trainings?
Yeah, we definitely had coaches. We had defence and we had attacking coaches, and we obviously had someone coaching one of the trial teams and someone helping out the other trial team, and which sort of taught how to tackle, I guess, and a few moves, backline moves, etc. So quick learning, really, a couple of weeks, and then we were into the game.
At the time, did you think about continuing to play rugby or was it for you just a one-off match?
I think at the time we just thought, wow, we've got a chance to play rugby. I personally didn't think we were making history. It was just a game of rugby, really. And just little things like, well, we could play on the oval. So it was never like this could be a big thing in the start of something, I don't think, anyway, for me. Did I play rugby afterwards? No, that was it.
There's no other further opportunities?
No, I don't think so. And then maybe, moved on, or no, didn't play rugby afterwards.
And suppose that rugby match, what was the reaction from the general public or those that were either spectators at the time, or the publicity that you received by it being advertised or broadcast on the radio? Was there a lot of support, or did you have challenging comments or sexist comments made towards that match, or what was it like? Do you remember?
I think we had sexist comments in the paper. On the trial games, there was definitely sexist comment. I actually didn't see a write-up of our the game against Hawke's Bay. There was support, and there were quite a few people watching, and a few came up afterwards and said they really enjoyed watching that and thought we were better than they thought we were going to be. And actually there were kids asking for our autographs, was like, wow. Never given my autograph to anyone before.
That just shows.
So that was a cool moment, actually.
Absolutely, and kids know no different, right? They've just seen rugby out there, and so that's quite amazing to know that you were out signing autographs after the game. Yeah. You mentioned before that during the trial games, the papers had sexist comments on there. Do you remember what was written about those trial games, or?
Oh, I think it was just written as a man's point of view, and what were the men googling at when they were watching the scrums, and so it was definitely pointed in that direction. And there are some write-ups in the paper about that, and it's clear to see. And when I first read it, I just went, oh, but never made a big deal of it, which now would be made a big deal of.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we get the sense that this is taking place in 1980. These are the kind of barriers that the women are facing to continue their rugby. It's being presented as a joke. It's being written up as a joke. And although Helen might not actually have seen it, the Manawatū Standard did report that the team showed, quote, admirable spirit and energy, end quote, to beat Hawke's Bay 11-0. And they also said that the women drew a decent crowd and repaid these people for their early attendance with a non-stop game of hard tackling and plenty of movement. The 11 points that Manawatū scored came from tries by Mary Connell and Helen McCall, and fullback Kim Hook kicked a good penalty. It is interesting to note as well that there are lots of close ties between players in these matches and established men's rugby. People often assume that if you are more involved in men's rugby, you have this understanding that rugby is a man's sport and therefore you would stay away from it. But actually what we tend to find is that players who are exposed to rugby, whether they're children who are exposed to rugby and have an interest in it, want to play, whether they're boys or girls, and brothers and sisters playing together in the garden, it's fairly normal. A lot of these women seize the opportunity to actually get on the pitch and do that kind of dream when their brothers had a more concrete pathway to actually be able to do that. In a surprising coincidence, Colette Wicks, who played flanker for Manawatū, and Jeanette Taylor from the Hawke's Bay squad, both of their brothers had made their All Blacks debut the day before this game. So Ken Taylor scored 2 tries for Fiji before being injured and replaced by Colette's brother, Craig, the 18-year-old Palmerston North Boys high school pupil. Neither Ken nor Craig played for the All Blacks again. And it's sadly a similar story for most of the players for the Manawatū and Hawke's Bay teams. So as we heard from Helen, try scorer, team captain, this was her one and only game. For many of them, they never played rugby again. There is, however, one hint at a slightly different story, which comes from a player profile style article printed ahead of the match. And here, Rosemary Soranke and Teresa Mawika are listed as playing rugby for 2 seasons prior to that 1980 game for teams called Fielding Freezing Works, Fielding Yellow Women, and Kenny's Crumpets, with a K, obviously. While not entirely surprising that there's no written record of these games, I can't find any mention of Fielding Yellow Women in the club's annual reports, and unfortunately local papers have not been digitised for this period, but it does suggest that women were participating in rugby in 1979, perhaps 1978, in the Fielding area, perhaps in social teams organised within their workplaces. And if anybody has any further leads on this, we're really wanting to follow up at the Rugby Museum, so please do chat to me at the end or reach out to us. It took 10 years for another Manawatū women's team to be formed. And while women's rugby was developing structurally in other places, particularly during the 1980s in Christchurch, there wasn't a regular club competition here until 1991. And again, women's rugby actually kick-started with another rep team. So Manawatū put together a representative team in 1990 to play against Taranaki on October the 6th, once again at the Oval, but this time Taranaki won 12-0. So women's rugby has gone from winning 11-0 10 years prior to losing 12-0 in a decade. Rose Soranke, who played in that 1980 game and whose player profile suggested that she had some rugby experience in the Fielding area, was the captain in 1990. So again, we're getting hints that there might be some, I won't call it underground women's rugby, because it was very likely was happening on a grassy field somewhere, but it's obviously rugby that's not being taken seriously by the sports establishments or by the newspapers as a sporting event. It might be that it's considered more social, organised within the work environment, but it's possibly giving players like Rosemary an opportunity to continue and to be ready to play representative level rugby again in 1990. Rugby historian Clive Akers actually attributes much of the growth to women's rugby in the 1990s in the Manawatū to Kia Toa member Christy Prue. And a quote from him is that her enthusiasm and encouragement gave the new women's game a solid start. Clive has also stated the barriers that women continue to face in the 1990s, namely from the rugby union. Administrators were reluctant to support women's rugby, perpetuating the idea that it wasn't a suitable sport for women, that it might even inhibit their ability to have children. This is in the 1990s. However, The referees sided with the women and were very helpful in getting games going, which eventually persuaded the union that women's rugby was here to stay. And teams from Kiatoa, Linton Army, Massey and the Teachers College were regulars in the competition throughout that decade, as well as the occasional team from Ororoa, Freiburg Old Boys, and even teams from Whanganui and from the other side of the gorge came to Palmy to compete. So during the 1990s, the women's rugby landscape is really changing in the Manawatū. And at the same time as it's developing here, women's rugby is going international. There were no Manawatū players in the first New Zealand women's squad at the unofficial 1991 Women's Rugby World Cup, which was a fully pay-to-play affair and did not gain approval from international rugby governing bodies. But the team in black did finish third, which gave them a good taste for it. However, New Zealand Rugby still wasn't fully on board with a women's programme, and in fact they prevented the team from attending the next World Cup in 1994, again because it was unsanctioned. However, the situation had changed by 1998, and the first official Women's Rugby World Cup, which was organised and paid for by the International Rugby Board, hosted a New Zealand team, and New Zealand brought home the win. This was also when the team settled on their name, the Black Ferns. So 1998 is kind of our Black Ferns origin story. Sometimes people forget that they did participate in that 1991 World Cup, and sometimes New Zealanders particularly forget that England won the 1994 World Cup, which did exist. I promise it was a real thing. So although there were no Manawatū players in the first New Zealand team, that's simply because women's rugby was less developed here during the 1980s than in other regions. So in contrast, by 1999, Manawatū is firmly on the women's rugby map. We're hosting a Tri-Nations competition. And in 2001, the Black Ferns captain, Farah Palmer, moved to Palmerston North to lecture on sports management at Massey University. She was an inspiring player, leading by example on the field and working hard off the paddock to raise the standard of local rugby. And I just have a shorter clip, just 2 minutes, from Farah talking about winning 3 Rugby World Cup titles in a row.
You won 3 World Cups. How were they different, and which one was most satisfying and why?
I get asked that question a lot actually about the World Cups, and each of them was special for different reasons. So the 1998 World Cup was the first sanctioned World Cup, and we had a mission to try and be professional and demonstrate what it meant to be professional, even if we weren't paid as professional athletes. So we would have water bottles. We were the only team that understood what carb loading, or getting everything back into your muscles. We were the only ones that seemed to have gear other than playing gear. So we were very fortunate. And so winning that World Cup was amazing, but not many people knew who we were. We weren't really that well known. So that was kind of a cool event in strange places like Amsterdam. And then the 2002 World Cup, the pressure was on because everyone expected us to win. So it was much tougher then, and all the other teams had kind of caught up and thought, hang on a minute, we all have to change the way we lead up to this event. And so it was much closer. And England was starting to kind of chomp at our heels. So to win that was just exhilarating because it felt like more of a challenge. And so that was really cool. And then 2006 was special for me because it was my last. So I knew that I was going to retire at the end of that. And that was probably my toughest in terms of physically for me and mentally, just trying to keep at the top of my game and feel like I deserved to be there, and Fiora was chomping at my heels as well. So that one was just I've done it, we've managed to win. It was a close game against England, and I just felt like I'd done everything I could as a player, and I was happy to step away.
So you guys probably already know Farah Palmer. I get the impression that she's quite a well-known local character, but just to list out some of this amazing woman's achievements, her whakapapa Māori comes from Ngāti Manawatū and Waikato Tainui. She captained 30 tests between 1997 and 2006 and won 29 of those. She was on the losing side only once, a 5-point defeat to England in Auckland in 2001. Her achievement in leading the Black Ferns to 3 successive Rugby World Cup titles in 1998, 2002, 2006 is outstanding and as yet unrivaled by any other athlete in rugby and other sports. There's been no captain who's won 3 World Cup titles back to back. In 2023, she was promoted to Dame Companion of the New Zealand Order of Merit for her services to rugby. She's served on the New Zealand Māori Rugby Board since 2007 and on the New Zealand Rugby Board since 2006. She became the first woman appointed to the New Zealand Rugby Board, but she is in the process of stepping down from those roles. In that same season that Farah Palmer moved to Palmy, 2001, a 14-year-old pupil from Freiburg High School was also selected for the Manawatū squad, with a name that you might recognise, Salika Winiata. So Winiata, that name that we saw as the chaperone from the 1923 team in Levin. Not only has Salika been a Manawatū Cyclones stalwart, she became the first woman to play for the Greens over 100 times, but she's also been a consistent part of the Black Ferns 15s and 7s teams. After 8 years of playing for the Manawatū, at just 21 years old, she was selected for her first international against Australia in 2008. Her official height was given as 1.55 metres, and her weight was just 52 kilograms, making her one of the smallest players in international rugby. And I've just got a little clip of Salika talking about her very first rugby experiences at a local club here.
First set of questions. What age did you first start playing rugby?
I started playing rugby when I was 5 years old. I took a form home from school, got my dad to take me down and sign me up. Back then you had to weigh in, so you had to jump on the scales, and the teams were dictated by weight, not age. And I got first experience playing with the boys, and I guess I have a real vivid memory of turning up on Saturday morning and, the opposition only had boys in their team and everyone pointing the finger, laughing that there was a girl in the opposition, and that girls can't play rugby. So it was great to be able to run around them and dot down to get a few tries and see them running off the field crying because, there was a girl that could actually play rugby.
Just to explain as well, all of these videos are part of the New Zealand Rugby Museum's Herstory exhibition, and the interviewer is another former Black Fern from this area, Christina Sue. She went to Palmerston North Girls High School, and she's the current Manawatū coach, so still kind of championing women's rugby in the local area. Salika Winiata was the top scorer for the first Sevens Rugby World Cup, which was held in Dubai in 2009. She scored 4 tries and 16 conversions, therefore winning the team 52 points. New Zealand were beaten in the final by Australia, 15-10. But her incredible Sevens and 15s career has just been on the up and up, although you can also see from her uniform that she is a full-time police officer whilst based here in New Zealand. She was part of the 2017 Rugby World Cup winning team, and she refereed at the Tokyo Olympics, where the Black Ferns Sevens team won gold, which they repeated again in the 2024 Paris Olympics. Being here in New Zealand during that and after that has been really inspiring to see within very small section of social media. There has not been very much public acknowledgement of that incredible feat, and it would be cool to see more celebrations. I know I've been learning about tall poppy syndrome here in New Zealand, but actually there's a lot to be proud of, especially with our women's rugby players. And although I haven't got time to explore this in more detail today, the women's sevens was actually crucial in getting sevens onto the Olympic schedule. As Miranda mentioned in my introduction, sevens wasn't actually part of the Olympics until 2016, but Salika's incredible performance at that 2009 tournament in Dubai was part of the testing and proving that women's rugby sevens was good enough to go into the Olympics, and that allowed the entire sport, men's and women's sevens, to go onto the Olympic stage. I have one more video of a local star to highlight today, and that is Rebecca Mahoney. And I just thought that her rugby origin story was very palmy and very fitting for this weekend with what's going on outside.
Yeah. Well, it's even saying goodbye anyway, no? Thanks for giving up your time to come and have and share your story as a player and now as a referee, as a mum, Rebecca. But firstly, tell us, what age did you start playing rugby and who inspired you as a young athlete?
Oh, I first started playing rugby when I was 15. Funnily enough, my inspiration was the local shearing gang. So the girls, the local rugby club, were all working for a shearing gang at the time, and they were all holding the sheep out the back in preparation for the golden shears. And my dad was working out the back in the yards, and he said, "Oh, my daughter likes to kick the ball around and likes to run around on the field, and she plays soccer." And they were like, "Oh, we'll have her, we'll sign her up." And I guess they are my inspiration because they are true women's rugby. They are the girls that turn up every week, and they always had a smile on their faces. They always love to have a beer afterwards, and I guess that's what always inspires me, is the grassroots of the game, I suppose.
I just think it's very special to hear that shearing gang started her off on a journey which has seen her win 2 World Cups and become one of New Zealand's leading female referees, officiating men's and women's first-class games, women's international matches, and she was the first woman to referee a Ranfurly Shield match between Otago versus North Otago, which apparently is like a big deal in men's rugby. I don't know. So the Manawatū has produced or nurtured some of the greatest rugby talent in the women's game. And the barriers that girls used to face to accessing the sport have significantly changed. It's much more commonly accepted and promoted in schools now, for example. Medical advice has certainly moved on from the 1890s, 1920s, and the 1980s. In fact, the continuity of that medical advice is what's concerning, and with doctors continuing to fear that rugby might make women infertile. So attitudes towards women's rugby have now changed, and players should now and can now be celebrated for their achievements on the local and indeed the world stage. Many may have previously overlooked the significance of the Manawatū in the broader development of women's rugby in New Zealand and internationally. But looking at this region with a microscope has allowed us to examine how rugby was established as a male preserve that women could only access occasionally before the 1990s, and how quickly, over the past 30 years, players have emerged to become some of the best in the world. The 1980 match is a perfect highlight of how something set up as a publicity stunt, a bit of a joke, can still be taken seriously by the participants. And thanks to that, Palmy can lay claim to hosting the very first interprovincial women's rugby game in New Zealand. I hope this talk has inspired you to come along to the Rugby Museum if you want to know more about the history of rugby, maybe to follow some local women's rugby, and certainly we can all be getting behind the Black Ferns, who are heading to the Women's Rugby World Cup in England later this year to fight to retain their title as world champions.